positive message from that is that our appetites still work. We haven't broken them. They're still there. They're still working. And as David said, if you put them in a healthy food environment, you don't need to count calories or macros or any of this stuff. No other animal in the history of life on Earth has ever had an app that helped it do that. It didn't need to, and nor do we, if we put our appetites in an appropriate food environment.
It is important to mention that as in so many things with evolution, there are trade-offs involved here, so that a high protein diet is good for reproduction, but what it does, it comes at a cost of shortening the healthy lifespan. So what that implies is that when you ask yourself the question, well, what is a balanced diet? You have to ask yourself the second question of balanced for what?
So today I have with me the authors of Eat Like the Animals, What Nature Teaches Us About the Science of Healthy Eating. Professor David Raubenheimer is a leading expert in nutritional ecology, which looks at how an animal's nutritional environment interacts with its biology to affect health and fitness. His studies of insects, fish, birds, and a variety of mammals have helped to develop a new approach to human nutrition-related problems, such as the dietary causes of obesity. Professor Stephen Simpson is an academic director of the Charles Perkins Centre, a professor in the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Sydney, and executive director of Obesity Australia. Both of these leading scientists have developed an integrative approach for nutrition called the geometric framework, which was devised and tested using insects, but is now being applied to many other animals, including humans. And to go over their awards and honors might take the rest of the podcast, so I'll just end there. Thank you both very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for inviting us. All right.
So to begin, this whole series that I've had devised of, a bunch of different experts with conflicting opinions is designed to answer the really difficult question of what are the foods that humans evolved to eat. So in the book, you write, and I quote, "Nothing about nutrition makes sense unless you understand the biological context in which the species evolved." So explain a little bit about what you mean here.
Do you want to take that, Steve, or should I?
You go, Dave. You go.
What we mean by that is that evolutionary theory, what Darwin gave us was a framework for understanding not just what happens in terms of animal biology, but why it happens, why different species evolve different characteristics in nutrition and all sorts of other aspects of life. In relation to specific requirements that are imposed on them by their environment. So if you want to ask the question, well, the one that you're addressing, what did humans evolve to eat? Then what you need to do in Darwinian theory is to go to the environment and look at the challenges that was posed by that environment and the adaptations that evolved in order to fit with that environment. And the same is true of all other species. And there's a real advantage in studying a wide range of species as we have, because then you can develop a big picture of the relationships between nutritional behavior and physiology and environmental requirements, and interpret human nutrition in the context of that big picture.
And that's very different from the conventional dietetics human medical approach to nutrition, and that's one of the things that we bring to the discussion. And I think the insights that have emerged, as David said, from looking comparatively across different species and asking the question, how have different species solved essentially the same problem, the problem of achieving a nutritionally balanced diet, which is a non-trivial problem. It's an incredibly complex thing ultimately to do. You need to balance your intake and utilization of dozens of different micro and macronutrients. Doing that within a food environment where your foods may be dangerous to acquire, time consuming to acquire, variable in space and time and in their composition, protected chemically in the case of many plants against being eaten, and so on and so forth. So it's a really challenging problem. The probably biggest problem that all organisms have faced since the origins of animal life. And by looking at how different species have done it in their different environments, we've come to the conclusion that you cannot understand the nutritional biology of an organism, either when it's going right or when it's going wrong, unless you understand that historical relationship with diet and environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that, you know, the way that an organism, I guess, kind of responds to a changing environment is a challenge because it needs to fulfill its nutritional needs. What, I guess it might be a really difficult question because humans kind of went all over the place. We kind of colonized the globe, so we faced kind of different challenges. But if you could make some sort of, you know, overarching generalization maybe about some of the problems humans face nutritionally, what would that look like?
Well, you've said it yourself. The challenge that humans faced in our evolution was diversity and variation. So as a species, we were selected and adapted to cope with a very wide range of ecological and dietary circumstances. You still see that variation in, you know, study the molecular genetics of African populations, where at least half of our evolution was in Africa. There's immense genetic variation, and it maps very well onto ecological variation, which relates to diet, and also linguistic variation, which relates to the culture that has developed together with that genetic evolution, adapting different populations to different environments in Africa. And then, of course, it became even more variable with humans leaving Africa and colonizing temperate regions in Europe and so forth. So generalism is the characteristic, I think, that most clearly defines human diet and nutrition.
Yes, we're the cockroach of the primates in many ways. We've evolved across a range of diverse diets, and our generalism and our capacity to do that has been a hallmark of the success, a precursor to the success of the species.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are, as a species in general, well adapted to a wide range of nutrient intakes. What we're well adapted to is a wide range of different foods, being able to utilize a wide range of different foods in order to achieve the nutrient intakes that our bodies require. And those nutrient intakes aren't nearly as variable. Those requirements aren't nearly as variable as the foods that we use to satisfy them.
Right. Yeah, that's I guess a major theme that I gleaned from the book. And I had a previous podcast guest who was also part of this series, Dr. Mickey Bendor, and he said that one of the most straightforward ways to determine the foods that humans evolved to eat is to look at the modern physiology, because we have some, you know, things built into us that can tell us things about the past, of course, which is what I think partially you've done with your book. And so I want to go to the Oxford Locust experiment and kind of start there. So you begin part of the book with the Oxford Locust experiment, and you find, quote, when locusts have a good choice of available foods, their appetite systems collaborate, and the insects combine the foods in exactly the right proportions to consume an optimally balanced diet. But when they're restricted to imbalanced foods, the appetites for protein and carbohydrate compete. For locusts, in the end, protein always wins. End quote. So tell me a little bit about the broader implications of this finding.
Well, the implications are several-fold. Those experiments showed to us that, firstly, locusts don't have just a single hunger. They're not hungry or full. They have appetites that are specific to different nutrients. And that's a really important insight, I think, or breakthrough at the time, because it allowed us then, and we talk about this in the book, to ask that question of other organisms. If locusts have specific appetites for protein, for carbohydrate, for salt. They're the three that we discovered early on in Locust. What about other species? And the answer to that question was yes, they're universal. There's a small number of specific nutrient appetites that are possessed of all animals. So pretty well anything we've looked at, from slime molds to people, that's true. The second really significant finding or insight that emerged from that experiment was that the appetites for different nutrients, when they're forced to compete with one another, there's an order of priority in their access to our hunger systems and to our feeding control systems. And in the locust, protein was the dominant nutrient. The appetite for protein was the thing that the animal, if you like, cared most about. So it would be willing to extend its development, end up obese, to get enough protein on a low protein, high carb diet. It would consume more calories than it needed to attain that, and then in the end end up fat and extending its development. Likewise, if you put it onto a higher than optimal protein diet with low carbs, it would eat less, it would become very lean, but it would suffer consequences of that as well. So the protein appetite system dominated in imbalanced environments. Now, we went on, of course, to show that that same principle applies to many other species, not all, but other species too show a dominant protein appetite, we humans among them.
I was just saying that's the one, as Steve said, the one really key insight was this nutrient-specific appetites, the discovery of nutrient-specific appetites and how they interact to help an animal compose a balanced diet. And a very important issue in the evolution of humans or any animal is because those appetites are what sit between the animal's physiology and the consequences of what it eats and the ecology that it uses to exploit nutrients. That's the evolution of those nutrient-specific appetites is critically important for understanding animal nutrition. You can understand why they've evolved, because animals require many nutrients, and each of those appetites is the animal's body's way of telling its brain what its specific nutrient requirement is at a particular time. Really important insight, which actually underpins the rest of what we've done and what we write about in the book, including human nutrition and its problems in modern environments.
It's led us deep into the mechanism of appetite, so into the brain, into the physiological control of appetite systems, including the protein appetite. But more than that, it's also led us to start to understand some really deep and important things about the way in which our appetite systems have gone awry in the modern industrialized food environment.
Right. So if I'm understanding correctly, in an environment that is protein poor, these animals and humans as well, there's the Swiss chalet study that you also did from the book. It seems that humans tend to kind of try to compensate for the lack of protein by eating more of the carbs and fats. And so by doing that, there's an overabundance of energy, there's an excess in calories. And so that kind of tends to lead towards obesity.
Right. That's what we call the protein leverage effect. And its involvement in the obesity epidemic, we originally called the protein leverage hypothesis, for which now there's substantial evidence emerged in recent years from a whole range of different sources.
I want to get into that because it would seem, just from the beginning of the book, it would seem, oh, protein's the answer. We should just eat a ton of protein and that's it, right? But no, there's a sort of bidirectional kind of link there with protein and health. So I want to get into that a little bit more. You first start to mention as one of the possible consequences of having too much protein, methionine and longevity. So kind of walk me through that briefly.
Well, if we take a step back, if as we found, animals care about eating either too little or too much protein. Both of them are avoided, and hence they regulate to a particular, what we call target intake of protein. That implies that not only are there costs to eating too little protein, and they're pretty obvious, you need protein to get nitrogen to grow, to reproduce, to maintain your tissues, but it also implies there's a cost to eating too much. And as evolutionary biologists, we were interested to try and understand what those costs might be. And initially we were working with flies and then mice, and then starting to extend the observations more broadly across human population data. And there really is an indication that excess protein intake and higher proportions of protein than at the target in diets, universally across organisms from yeasts to monkeys, are associated with rapid aging, elevated risk in midlife and early late life of a whole range of cardiometabolic and other diseases. So, and the mechanisms of that are now being unpacked in real detail by a series of groups, including our own, across the world. Now, that begs the question, what is it about protein that's causing the problem? And the obvious first hypothesis to test is it's something to do with the ratio of amino acids within proteins, because proteins, as we all know, are made up of 20 common amino acids. 9 or so are essential to us. We can't manufacture them ourselves. We need them in our food and our diet. And those amino acids can come in an endless variety of ratios. And what's been discovered is that if you get the balance of those wrong, then you can either speed up or slow down the impacts of excess protein on aging and mid-late life or early late life cardiometabolic health. Now, some of the key amino acids involved, methionine and the sulfur amino acids are among them. The branch chain amino acids are also among them. And the question of what's the optimal balance of those 20 amino acids and which of the foods that provide them or food combinations is an active and very exciting question at the moment in the study of nutritional science.
It is important to mention that as in so many things with evolution, there are trade-offs involved here, so that the data indicates that a high protein diet is good for reproduction, for preparing the bodily machinery to reproduce. But what it does, it comes at a cost of shortening the healthy lifespan. So what that implies is that when you ask yourself the question, well, what is a balanced diet? You have to ask yourself the second question of balanced for what? A diet that is well balanced for reproduction and success early in life might well, and in fact does, the evidence tells us, come at a cost in terms of late life health and longevity.
And it also begs another really important question, which is what's the difference between a therapeutic diet and a healthy population diet? And this brings up some of the real complexities that arise around the high protein, low carb diet versus the healthy populations of humans across the planet who have high carbohydrate, healthy carbohydrate, low protein diets. How do we reconcile those things? And the answer is actually quite simple. A high protein, lower carb, or indeed low fat and carb diet will limit energy intake because of protein leverage. We understand the mechanism of that. That will lead to weight loss and will also help redress metabolic dysregulation. Type 2 diabetes and so on can be improved with such a diet. But the benefits of weight loss and helping metabolic health will in that case outweigh the costs associated, which are longer term costs in terms of accelerated rates of aging and so on. But it's that cost, that benefit cost ratio that needs to be considered. So short-term use of a therapeutic diet to reset metabolism makes a great deal of sense, because the costs that you're paying are trivial in comparison to the benefits. That's not the same thing as saying when you're a healthy weight, healthy metabolically, that maintaining yourself on such a diet is the right thing to do. So it just requires a little bit of nuance and a breakaway from the zealotry that tends to accompany some of the dietary fads at the moment, and create a great deal of heat and not a lot of light.
Yes, yes.
And related to that is the evolutionary question, where another very prominent part of this fad diet debate is what were the protein levels in the evolutionary human diet? Now that's an interesting debate. It's complex because, as we've already said, there's great variation in human populations through space and time. But in some respects, it's irrelevant. And the reason that it's irrelevant, one of the reasons is that, as I said earlier on, different protein levels optimize different outcomes. So a high protein diet would have been better suited to optimizing the outcome that was relevant to evolving Paleolithic humans, which is reproductive success, reproduce before the very high chance of dying of infection or of accident, which was a big issue in those times. Before you died, reproduce. So high protein diets were important then. And the cost in terms of reduced longevity wouldn't be nearly as high, for the reason that you stood a high chance of dying prematurely in any case. But in modern human populations, we've got to ask ourselves, do we really want to eat a diet that enables us to have 10 children? Or do we want to eat a diet that enables us to live a long and healthy life? And the optimal diet for those two outcomes is very different.
Yeah, I think for some of the listeners and the viewers who aren't really sure, like methionine, what does that have to do with, like protein sources from, animal protein sources or plant-based protein sources? And my understanding is that animal-based protein sources have more methionine. But typically, like things like a chickpea, for example, would have lower amounts of the methionine. So would that be correct to say?
Yeah, look, the animal and plant-based proteins do tend to differ in their amino acid balance. That's certainly true. So the branched chain amino acids, methionine, sulfur amino acids are more abundant in some animal than in some plant proteins. I think the other important indicator is that plant-based proteins tend to be more variable in their amino acid composition than animal-based proteins, and that requires that you need to eat a variety of plant-based proteins to gain a balance of amino acids, and it's easier eating animal-based proteins to get that balance. But that doesn't mean plant or animal-based proteins per se are better than one another. It's just that they're different. But the population level data does suggest that a diet high in plant-based proteins has healthier outcomes on average than one high in particularly processed animal-based proteins. I don't think there's much controversy about that anymore. But the key is that the balance of amino acids requires, to get that balance, you require a variety of different protein sources in your diet to really achieve it. Bearing in mind too that your requirements change as you go through your life with development. They also change with the status of your immune system, whether you're subject to infection, whether you're reproducing, whether you're exercising heavily, undergoing anabolic processes or catabolic processes as you age. So it moves, it varies, requirements change over time, and we often try and fit a one size fits all diet to the entire life course. And we need to be probably a little bit more nuanced in understanding how nutritional requirements change according to circumstance and development and so on.
And that's one of the really important reasons that animals and humans alike have evolved nutrient-specific appetites, because it enables them to track those changes over short time frames, to eat more energy, more fat, carbohydrate when they need it, eat more protein when they need it, and to balance the diet according to their specific requirements at a given time.
So we've done some, I think, extraordinarily interesting experiments over the years. For example, infecting caterpillars with a lethal virus, which is actually used to control pest caterpillar populations. And we found that if you infect a caterpillar with this particular virus, it will shift its diet to increase its protein intake. And having done that, it stands a better chance of withstanding the infection, not dying. And if you confine the caterpillar to a diet where it can't do that, then you can show that when infected, they need more protein to survive than when they're uninfected. There are many other examples. There's some beautiful work done in fruit flies showing that when the male inseminates the female, he introduces a little peptide, a small protein molecule called the sex peptide, which acts in her brain to turn on her protein appetite. So she then starts to select protein-rich foods to support the development of her eggs. So the biological systems that underpin these responses are really remarkable, and we document some of that in the book, of course.
These aren't just things that happen in the artificial circumstances of laboratory experiments. We've shown, for example, that rhesus macaques and a lot of primates do this when they're lactating, highly energetic, demanding time of the life cycle. They increase their intake of energy and nutrients by the equivalent amount. We've shown in monkeys in China living in a temperate environment that in the winter, when it's very cold, they increase specifically fat and carbohydrate intake to match the additional energetic costs of keeping warm through the cold winters. Protein intake stays the same, but specifically the fat and carbohydrate appetites track that increased energetic requirement. So it happens both in the lab, where we can control all of the circumstances of the experiment and we can establish causality. We know what's causing what, and it happens in the wild where there's relevance. It's relevant to animals in their daily lives and the ecologies where they evolved.
There are a few arguments against, the idea that plant proteins are superior to animal proteins. And the few that come to mind right now are that in order to form a complete protein of the 9 essential amino acids, you would need to generally have higher calories and higher carbohydrate amount, which some people view as bad, some people don't. But my question would be, would this, having a little bit more calories when trying to form a complete protein, would that counteract, the low methionine that you'd get from avoiding the animals?
It depends entirely on the nature of the carbohydrates. Most whole food, plant-based whole foods are not high in the sorts of calories that we know are causing the principal problems when it comes to obesity and all the associated comorbidities. And there, of course, the ultra processed foods, the highly industrially processed foods. Most plant-based carbohydrates in whole foods are tough to digest, so they're resistant to digestion if digestible by us at all. And they, of course, play important roles in feeding our microbiome and maintaining its diversity and its functional integrity. And that, in turn, is a key part of our appetite control systems. Our immune function is trained through that community of bugs, and everything else about our health is intimately related, it seems, to those communities of microorganisms. So it's hard to find an argument that would say that high plant-based diets, whole food plant-based diets, even if they're involving extra calorie consumption, are problematic to health. I don't think any of the population level data would indicate that. But these are all around the margins, it seems to me, in the discussion about the human global challenges around obesity and metabolic disease. The smoking gun there, as we develop the argument very clearly in the book, is this entire industry of ultra processed foods. Now, if you want to balance your protein intake, you can do it through selecting multiple different plant-based proteins. You don't need to think about it other than maintain a variety of plant-based proteins in your diet. Your appetite control systems will do the rest.
And as you say, the epidemiological evidence supports that. The circumstances in which we see protein leverage, that is overeating energy, and particularly carbs and fats, are those, as Steve said, in which the food system has a lot of ultra-processed foods. If you look at even largely plant-based dietary patterns in traditional populations, you don't see obesity at all. Okinawan, Japanese Okinawan, traditional Okinawans, many of the forest hunter-gatherers, the Kitavan Islanders, low protein, high plant content in the diet, and they're lean and healthy and long-lived.
What about the argument that animal proteins are more bioavailable and they're one of the most nutrient dense foods? Something like organ meats, for example, ranks like one of the highest foods in terms of nutrient density, which would, in a sense, allow you to eat less food and still have the essential micronutrients.
Well, there's a couple of things there. You wouldn't want to eat an entirely organ meat based diet. I think organ meat is a fabulous source of some of the micronutrients and protein and other things. Not a good source of bulk and fiber and healthy carbohydrates or some of the healthy fats, actually. So it's organ meats per se are a healthy food, but you wouldn't eat an entire organ meat diet, or at least that would be challenging.
Right.
So I think it's a matter of keeping that sort of relationship. What are healthy foods? What combinations of foods construct healthy diets? And there are innumerable combinations, and different cultures around the world have traditions and food cultures that have achieved that outcome in very different ways and extraordinarily interesting and delicious ways. But as David said initially, we all end up eating a remarkably similar macronutrient and micronutrient intake, irrespective of population. The boundaries, the range in those values are really quite small. The way that we do it is as variable as food cultures.
And for those populations that are exceptions, like the traditional Inuit diet or the Maasai diet, they have specific genetic adaptations that are associated with those unusual diets. So they're not representative of humans in general. They are outliers, and as do all animals, all species, they've adapted to that specific, unusual food environment in which they evolved.
Which may in turn have made them more susceptible to poor health outcomes on a modern Western industrialized food diet. And the reason for that being that if we talk about targets and moving targets, your nutrient requirements change throughout the life course. They also change over evolutionary time, and they do so to track the environment, the food environment within which the animal is evolving, not just has evolved, but is evolving. And if you've evolved in a high protein, low carbohydrate environment, you will have evolved adaptations to manage the problems of that food environment. So we think, for example, that oceanic populations like the Inuit and some of the traditional populations who are hunter-gatherer based may have higher protein targets genetically. And the higher your target, the greater you are of having to or the greater risk you are of overconsumption of energy in a low protein junk food environment, because you've got to eat more to get to your higher protein target.
Right. That's something I wanted to ask you about, the protein target. How is it that you can change, the protein target?
Well, the protein target changes throughout the life course anyway. So it starts off actually very low as a proportion of your dietary energy. So breast milk is only 7% protein, very high in fat and carbs, but that's the optimum diet for a human infant. Throughout the rest of your life course, the proportions change. They go typically from 15% to a little higher, 20% during, for example, pregnancy, or in late life where you become less efficient at using protein. So they're changes that will occur throughout development as a natural part of the developmental process across the life course. But on top of that, you can have other changes imposed by your health and lifestyle. So the protein target goes up if you become insulin resistant. And we think that will trigger a vicious cycle. The higher your protein target, the more you've got to eat to get to it in a junk food world, which means it'll go up even further, and you've got to chase that rising target. The reason for that is that insulin normally inhibits your breaking down protein. So either lean protein in your muscles and bones, or protein that you have in circulation in the form of amino acids. You normally wouldn't burn those to produce glucose. But if you've got enough carbohydrate in your diet, you don't burn protein. But insulin is what normally inhibits that. So if you become resistant to insulin, you start to burn your own protein. That means, and break it down. And that means you're ultimately going to have to eat more protein to reach your increased target. And the higher the target, the more you're going to overconsume calories in a junk food world. So obesity and insulin resistance can increase the protein target, and that will put you at greater risk of further obesity, because you have to eat more in a junk food world to reach your higher target. And we think that's what's caused the obesity epidemic to continue to accelerate over decades rather than plateau. And if you think about it, if it was simply we've eaten too much junk and that's made us fat, then that should have plateaued as a global phenomenon of increased body weight. And the reason for that being that the bigger you are, the more calories you need. So if you're induced to overconsume calories by being placed in a junk food world, you'd get bigger, you'd require those extra calories to stay bigger, and you would plateau in your weight, and the global population would have stabilized in terms of its obesity. But that hasn't happened. It's continued to grow, and it needs, therefore, a vicious cycle, something that can drive it in a positive feedback. And we think that's what it is. Increasing protein target driven by the consequences of increased body fat, particularly visceral body fat, which is, of course, insulin resistance and all the associated comorbidities.
Got it. That makes sense.
We also think that the well-established correlation between human infants being formula-fed, milk formula-fed, and obesity later in life is related to the same thing, because typically milk formula has a higher protein content than human breast milk. Well, that is changing now, but at least historically, until very recently, it did, and some still do. And we think that what's happening is that the relatively high protein diet of human infants conditions the body to reduce protein efficiency, And what that means, the reduced efficiency increases the intake requirement for protein later in life. And that drives obesity through protein leverage.
I want to shift gears a little bit. I know we're coming up on the edge of time here, towards your mega mouse study that you had. It's titled "The Ratio of Macronutrients, Not Caloric Intake, Dictates Cardiometabolic Health, Aging, and Longevity in Ad libitum fed Mice." And I came across a few critiques which I wanted you to address. And one of them was that several of the mice on the low protein diet were euthanized due to weight loss, among several other reasons, and that the high protein mice ate about 60% of their calories from protein, which is a very, very high amount. And the critique here is that this can't be used to say that humans should eat less protein for longevity. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, there's some remarkably ill-informed criticisms of that experiment, which totally fail to understand the design and the results. So that's the first thing to say. Yes, we set up the experiment with initially 30 different diets that they were systematically varied in their protein, fat, and carbohydrate content. The experiment involved placing a large number of mice on one of these 30 diets at weaning, so right at the beginning of life. And the aim of the experiment was to look at late life health and longevity and patterns of aging, which relates to what we were saying earlier. When we had the protein content below 5%, and the energy density of the diet, which was the other manipulated variable, low in combination with that, the mice, as very young mice, just didn't grow. So what we'd just simply shown there is we'd exceeded their capacity to utilize those foods for growth. And so those animals had to be removed from the experiment. That was according to the ethics protocol that you sign up to when you actually begin an experiment. So that there's absolutely nothing interesting about that, except that mice can't grow on a 5% low energy diet, nor can we actually. Then the patterns that we saw across our remaining 25 diets, which were varied systematically in protein, fat, and carbohydrate, the models that we fit to those a large number of points derived from this large number of animals, more than 700 animals, you fit surface responses, and those surface responses are robust to taking out the extreme high protein diets. If you remove them, you get the same pattern, and they're incredibly robust. So the conclusions from that paper are absolutely watertight and have been replicated by us and by numerous other labs around the world many times since. It changed the paradigm in our understanding of the relationship between nutrients, nutrient balance, calorie intake, longevity, and late life health. So that's the first thing. Every single criticism that we've seen, and there are a couple of really strident ones, are ludicrous, statistically wrong and naive, and driven by a zealotry which is sadly part of the nature of the fad diet community. People have ideological attachment to their beliefs, and anything that doesn't fit them needs to be attacked. And that's kind of regrettable. But anyway, those results are absolutely robust. The one interesting thing that emerged out of the analysis was that when you put an animal on a diet of fixed composition for its entire life, you prevent it from being able to track its own changing requirements throughout life, as we spoke about earlier. So what we subsequently did was take the same data from that experiment and analyze the age-specific mortality as animals develop throughout their lifespan. And what that showed was that was a more sophisticated, we had to develop the techniques to do that. And that publication, which came out in 2019, has a really, I think, very interesting take on those same data. And it shows convincingly that a low protein, higher carbohydrate diet particularly supported healthiest midlife. A higher protein diet was necessary earlier in life for reproduction, and that we published those data as well. Then when you get to late life, the mice that survived to that period on a high protein diet, and there were fewer of them compared to a low protein diet, if they did survive into late life, then they did better on a high protein diet. And that reflects, as we were saying earlier, the needs for aged organisms, humans or mice, to have to increase their protein intake in their very late life because they start to burn their own protein as part of the aging process. So it was a very important study. It's been replicated, it's absolutely solid, and has given rise to a great deal of new insight into the underlying mechanisms of biology and disease across the life course.
It's also important to stress that those criticisms are not criticisms that come from scientists in the scientific literature. These are criticisms that are out there in the public domain that are associated, I think, exclusively with people who don't believe the evidence, but don't want to believe the implications of what that experiment tells us in terms of the composition of diets.
Right. Yeah. As always, nutrition, the world of nutrition is just so ridiculously dogmatic. And so, yeah, my reason for bringing that up is just kind of seeing, how true is that actually? Because you never know.
Yeah, no, look, you can tell that we've got kind of frustrated by, there's only quite literally one or two people who have this sort of deranged view, and they're pushing it in a way that is sort of laughable, actually. It's been quite entertaining at one level to watch how people can distort things despite the evidence to fit whatever their preconception happens to be. Yeah.
We're used to seeing it in politics, but it's a sad turn of events that we see it in one of the most important issues in our lives, which is diet.
Oh yeah,
because it really results in misinformation, and that translates into poor public health.
Right. Yeah. And I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you guys are suggesting just eat low protein, nor are you suggesting eat high protein. What I'm hearing, which is a fascinating result, by the way, is there's trade-offs to everything, right? And so having more protein when you're developing, but not necessarily when you were first born, right? You said that wasn't so good to have high protein at that point, but it changes throughout the life cycle. And maybe midlife, yeah, it might be better for you to not have as much protein. And then as you grow older, like you mentioned, that might be a better time for you to slightly increase your protein intake.
Totally right. Absolutely. It's all about balance and nuance. And there's another really important aspect that we have also studied in great detail, and that is that the quality of your carbs and fat and protein matters a lot. So we've already spoken about amino acid balance. We published last year a really important paper. Again, it was a mouse paper, but really, I think, an important one, showing that the benefits of a low protein, high carbohydrate diet during midlife in a mouse are entirely dependent on the nature of the carbohydrate. And we found that the very best outcomes were if there was a lot of resistant starch in that carbohydrate, and the worst outcomes, completely countermanding the benefits of low protein, came when you coupled low protein with high fructose corn syrup as the principal dietary carbohydrate. So that is very telling because, of course, the principal sweetener added, particularly in the US, to processed foods is high fructose corn syrup, which is a 1-to-1 or near enough ratio of pure glucose and pure fructose. Interestingly, that was worse than even having sucrose, which is the same two monosaccharides as a disaccharide. That had less bad outcomes than having them separated as you do in high fructose corn syrup. So the type of carbs, the ratio with respect to protein, the balance of amino acids in those proteins, these are all really important things as well.
I mean, all of this sounds complex, and it is complex. Nutrition is immensely complex. That's part of the problem. But just because the challenges are complex, it doesn't mean the solution needs to be complex. And what everything we've done points to is that there's a very simple solution to this, and that is avoid processed foods. Avoid foods, highly processed foods, foods that are manufactured in factories rather than grown in fields and subsequently minimally processed in various ways. That's not an issue. Because when foods are manufactured, the sort of intrinsic correlations between nutrients that our bodies have evolved to thrive on are broken down, and new correlations are created, not in the interests of our health, but in the interests of commercial success. So what our work tells us overall is that if we surround ourselves with real foods, we place ourselves in a real food environment, we can let our biology do the rest. That's what it's evolved to do. That's what it does in all species. That's what it did for most of our evolutionary history. We didn't have these problems. That's a simple solution. It's a one-hit solution. Reduce the intake of processed foods.
Positive message from that is that our appetites still work. We haven't broken them. They're still there. They're still working. And as David said, if you put them in a healthy food environment, you don't need to count calories or macros or any of this stuff. No other animal in the history of life on Earth has ever had an app that helped it do that. It didn't need to, and nor do we. If we put our appetites in an appropriate food environment.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for your time. Before we go, where can people find out more about both of you?
Well, I guess read the book would be a good place to start. And the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney is where we both work, and it's a place that we've built from scratch to tackle exactly these sorts of challenges, which involves everything from philosophers and historians and sociologists through to basic metabolic scientists, evolutionary biologists, creative writers and more. So it's an extraordinary place, and you can find more about that online, and you'll see us there. And we're always happy to entertain questions.
All right. Thank you both very much for your time. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, all right.